Hi, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on making the case for the cloud, how to convince leadership it's time to migrate to a modern infrastructure. I'm Mary Beth Hamilton, Chief Marketing Officer here at Dataprize, and I am going to go over a couple of housekeeping items before introducing our experts and setting the stage for why we are having this conversation. So first up, the webinar will run about 45 to 60 minutes or an hour. It's being recorded, so the recording as well as the presentation, slides, and some other resources will be sent to you when we are done within the next 24 hours. And also we would encourage you to submit questions in the GoToWebinar Q&A function, and I will be sure to save some time at the end to ask our speakers those questions. And if there's anything that we're not able to cover during this conversation, we always welcome conversations post-event, so please feel free to reach out with those as well. So next, let me just take a quick moment to tell you about Dataprize in case you don't know us. We are a leading strategic IT solutions provider to IT leaders across the United States who believe, as we do, that technology should enable you to do the absolute best that you can with your business. So on the right-hand side here, you will see some of the various solutions that we deliver to the market. We are differentiated in how we deliver our cloud, cybersecurity, and managed services. For this webinar, we are going to talk more deeply about that cloud component, but do know that we take a cyber-first mentality to all of our solutions. So not surprisingly, you will hear some cyber and security considerations, which are very big when considering a move to the cloud. And on the left-hand side, just some notable stats from how many clients we support to how many employees we have. And then our breadth of certifications is quite broad. So now let me introduce you to who is joining me for this conversation. We have Jeff Averbeck, who's our Vice President of Cloud Services. He specializes in Azure infrastructure deployments and Azure Direct CSP services with Azure Managed Services. He has extensive experience in, you'll probably guess this, Azure and VMware virtual environments, as well as a whole host of other cloud-related strategy, migration, and consulting expertise. We're also joined by Alan Pinter, who is an Azure subject matter expert. He provides consultative expert guidance to our customers throughout their cloud and Azure journeys. He works very closely with engineering and project management teams to ensure successful outcomes throughout the customer's journey to the cloud. So before I bring them into the conversation, let me just briefly touch on why we are having this conversation and what topics we're going to be covering. So the genesis of it is making the case for the cloud, and there are many benefits and considerations you're going to hear our experts talk about throughout this conversation, looking at security, performance, flexibility, and then the cost considerations and benefits of moving to the cloud. And on the right-hand side here, just to sort of reiterate why we're having this conversation, is that organizations at a rapid pace are taking a look at migrating all or parts of their organization to a cloud infrastructure. As noted here, one stat in 2020, 60% of businesses migrated some portion of their workloads to the cloud. And then this next stat from Deloitte touches on, 58% of IT professionals believe that security and data protection were key drivers for their migration to the cloud. And then following up on that is the data modernization component and the cost and performance. So each one of these will be areas that you hear our experts get into with some more depth. And then the goal being that you can apply these to your organization so that you can take advantage of those benefits. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first question. And Jeff, I'm going to have you answer this one and give us some expert advice here. It's how does migrating to a modernized infrastructure impact an organization's overall security posture and the ability to detect modern day threats such as ransomware and ultimately protect their users?
Yeah, what we're talking about here is actually the security at the identity level, and that is primarily around the O365 world. And with that, there are a lot of, basically the cloud is only as secure as you make it. So let me just put that right on the table. You can leave it wide open, just like you run possibly in your own office infrastructure, and you'll get the same effect. The phishing attacks are really where most of the ransomware and the user penetrations come from. And so what we have the ability to do in Azure in the cloud and O365 is invoke security at the identity level as well as other levels to stop that. In fact, why don't you go to the next slide, Mary Beth? And with that, basically, these are all of the different attack vectors that you can get from the world of IT. And so a lot of them, the one on the very left of your screen, Defender for O365, that is actually built into a lot of the licenses that people buy, whether they have an E3 or an E5 or something like that. And so you can actually turn that on as an included cost. And what that does is it protects against the phishing attacks and the identity-based attack vectors that you have, the external threats that are coming in, clicking on a bad URL, all that kind of stuff. And then you'll see in the middle, this is something that has been developed over the years by Microsoft, and they're very good at it, is Microsoft Sentinel. And so what happens with all of these attacks is you have to have some place to display those attacks and then either possibly do automated workbooks and other things to stop those attacks and keep people from really getting into trouble. And so the other components that you see here cover the rest of the workloads that you have possibly on-prem. If we move them to Azure through IaaS or through platform as a service or infrastructure as a service or software as a service, then we can implement these different modules, and then you have a complete protected threat vector from outside world. So that's really what we're trying to get across, is that you're only as good as what you choose to implement. And it does take a little bit of expertise to figure out what to put where. But once you do the implementation of all of this, you have an extremely secure profile. And if you can actually do a lot of this on-prem through other software, that is done separately, and you buy 4 or 5 packages and you can cover all of this. The nice thing about what we're doing in Azure and within Microsoft ecosystem is that all of these modules interrelate with each other, so you don't have separate software packages. So just to go over some of the threat capabilities, I'm not going to get into a lot of the detail from here, but one other thing that we try to do, and we're going to have another seminar on this in the future, is actually deploy a zero trust methodology, which I believe Alan's going to talk a little bit about. And what that really means is that your email identity is only good for that level, meaning you can't log in as an admin with your email. That is exactly how the phishing attacks happen, and they elevate privileges through the chain. If you have admin access to a variety of places, then all of a sudden you're owned. So with that, we can go on to the next one.
Perfect. So the next topic that we wanted to talk about was the data protection aspect of it. And I wanted to highlight, before you dive into the benefits, considerations, and all the other reasons why the cloud is ideal for DR, what is being seen in the industry. So one of our partners, Veeam, recently released a cloud data protection report, and some of the key trends that they found are stated here, right? That 67% of organizations use cloud services as part of their data protection strategy. And we're certainly seeing that across the clients and organizations that we're working with, that there is a preference for and a benefit of using the cloud for data protection and DR. And then the reality of it is the prevalence with which organizations can suffer outages and downtime, which points to the direct need of why you need disaster recovery and why it's got to be a core tenet of your business and business resilience strategy. And one thing, it's not this direct question, but I will ask you in the end, Jeff, to touch on it, is the idea that, oh, I'm in the cloud, I already automatically have DR, which is not a safe assumption to make. So with that, and with that backdrop of the organizations and what is occurring in the industry. Jeff, can you talk about how does migrating to the cloud or utilizing the cloud for DR impact, I guess, existing efforts as well as enhance them or change an organization's approach?
Yeah, this is a bit of a complex topic because there's varying levels of protection in DR. We'll start out with the identity. I think it's a bit of a misnomer that your email O365 is automatically backed up. That's not the case. You basically have 30 days that Microsoft keeps, and then it goes into oblivion. So there is a necessity, especially for eDoc searches and things like that, that you keep backups in that area. And there's several built-in backup capabilities within Microsoft stack, Veeam, and several others that can be used. And so that is one area just on the identity side. The big one that really can have more business impact probably is really how you back up your infrastructure, and whether you have a DR as a service capability or a DRAS capability and what's going on. When we deploy in Azure, we use a foundations methodology, and it automatically will stand up you pick a data center that you want to deploy everything into, whether it's US East, US East 2, or Central within the Azure infrastructure. And then Azure automatically has a sister data center that it's connected to. And so the good thing is that in the old days, if you wanted to do this, you would have to buy a second data center location, set up vMotion or do something like that to get that replication, or use SAN replication, whatever you want to. So you're paying double the infrastructure, automatically to get, DR like that, especially if you need a quick, RPO, RTO. The thing that happens in Azure is, you still have to do backups, and you can use Veeam backup or Azure backup to do that. So you can do incrementals, and you can have, time-based restores throughout that backup. And so that is still necessary. And the other thing you can do is you can do snapshots. The hypervisors in Azure are very similar to VMware. And so you can actually do a snapshot within Azure at whatever time you want, whether it's once an hour, once a day. And the way it works is you do a full snapshot, and then it does incrementals after that. So that is an extremely quick way of doing, return to operation by doing all of that. The thing that is more important is if you want to do a automated, that would be a manual restore. If you want to do an automated failover, there actually are things. Veeam works very well in this environment, and the other thing that works very well is actually Azure Site Recovery. And what it's intended to do is make a disk level / machine level synchronized backup on a time basis to another region. And then you can actually take and have it auto fail to that new region and basically not lose anything, because all of the networking is already done. So the DNS actually changes and everything else does too. So, I don't want to get too technical with all of this stuff, but basically your backup and your recovery consists of 4 different plans. It can be the traditional backup, it can be the snapshot restore, it can, in some cases, you may be required to be able to do a recovery off-site, meaning outside of Azure. And Dataprize actually has a very strong product that's based on Veeam that will allow you to do that. So if we have to be outside of the cloud for security reasons, or just because they want to make sure that they have an alternative to the cloud, then that can be done. And so basically, it's the same process, use the same backups. And in this case, we're using a Veeam appliance up there to do all of the backups, copies them off-site to an off-site data center that we have. And if you actually want to spin it up, all you have to do is click a button, and Veeam through its process will restore those and make them run. And then you do some DNS magic, and it's online. So in the DR and business continuity efforts, it just is it's a more simplistic approach because of the tools that you have and the ready available various tools from various vendors that can be implemented. So you don't have to change what you're doing already in a lot of cases because the vendors are supported, and we just actually will help you deploy it into the cloud and make sure that whatever tools are being used, they can be used up there through backups or otherwise.
Perfect. And Alan, I'm going to bring you on the next question. Anything you wanted to add on this one before we move on to performance?
Oh, no, I think Jeff did a good job there.
I concur. So with that, we've talked security, we've talked disaster recovery. Let's talk about what are some of the key performance and cost considerations as organizations are building their strategy and plan for modernizing with the cloud.
Sure. So two of the questions I always get is how performant is the cloud, and do I really know how much it's going to cost me? So we have worked with many customers over the years to identify exactly what their workloads are and how much horsepower do they actually need. And from there, we can generate a very true apples to apples comparison of what that workload will cost in Azure versus if you had to buy, say, new on-prem hardware. Lots of times we see customers who have over provisioned their hardware. And so taking a really live performance look at that workload, we can see exactly how to best fit that in Azure, both from day one and also once that's running in Azure for a few months, we can most likely right size that again as well to save the customer additional money as well.
Perfect. Should I go over to the next one where you give an example of
Please do.
that? There we go.
So here you can pretty much see what I was just referring to. One is kind of looking at the real world performance numbers and comparing what the on-prem base cost would be, both as pay-as-you-go and also kind of doing reserved instances. Reserved instances are a great way to save additional money in Azure on top of right sizing by actually prepaying for a compute or storage unit for at least 1 year to 3 years. That way you actually get, say, 40% savings from there as well. From storage, we can take a look at the IOPS and throughput needed and find the best storage medium. That could be, hot SSDs or hot spinny disks, and apply that to the workload level as well. I will also give you different options of the Azure VM SKUs. There's not a one size fits all with Azure VMs. They have different SKUs that are aligned to different types of workloads. So we can pick and choose that workload, that VM, and also take cost considerations into account as well to make sure that we meet your budget, but also make sure the workloads can be performant in Azure. And this is just an example for the savings. This is not a, typical, you will save this much money every time we do an assessment for you.
We did put on the bottom of it actual savings may vary, but we wanted
Yes.
to give an example, right, of the different areas that you're looking at and the different consideration components that give you that ability to right size your environment.
Mm-hmm. Go to the next slide, please.
Yep.
This is more of like the usage we see. Basically, discovery CPU usage, we're actually seeing only about 12% of the CPU being utilized during the assessment period, which usually takes 2 to 4 weeks. We do like to hit, the peaks and valleys of a workload. If it's a very spiky workload, we want to make sure we get a full month's data. That way you understand the life cycle of that application. If it's a very steady state application, maybe only 2 weeks is needed. And from there, we can use these metrics I mentioned before to right size the workload in Azure and give you different options on the Azure VM sizing and also the storage medium to use. You go to the next slide.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to mention here is if you could go back real quick, if you look at the performance VM sizing versus on-prem, you see an E2 there. That means it's a 2-core machine. If you see the E16, it's a 16-core machine. So that's what we can do. We can look at the performance. We can use a 2-core machine to do the same workloads at a lot less cost, the same way with the disk IOPS. So we have a standard disk under the performance side, and you're using a premium disk, meaning SSDs or other on the on-prem side. So that's how we right size. We basically look at how things are running on-prem through the tools that we use, and then we can size it accordingly. And sorry, you can go ahead.
Well, and then one question on that, how much variability once we've gone through, and Alan, you would reference that, once it's been running for a while, go back and do a look back, and if we're over provisioned, but once we get it to what that right size is there a lot of variability or? how's that managed?
Not so much. Usually there's only variability on the applications that either see an organic spike because additional users or workflows are required. Usually we get it pretty right the first time based off the assessment data. And then from there, we can look at consolidating workloads onto one server if need be as well.
Excellent. So then the next one was assessment insights.
So again, just kind of showing you, storage, compute on-prem versus performance costing, disk types, disk SKUs, just giving you more granular detail of the options and what we consider to be the right fit for this workload. And that way you have the informed decision to make, and you can choose, which premium disk you want or standard disk, et cetera, and which Azure VM series. You can go on the next slide too.
Yeah, and I would imagine you have great depth, so we're able to provide some guidance and consulting on what are the trade-offs of checking each one of those, because it can come across quite complex, but obviously given how often you and others on the team are working through it, it's easy to sort of guide in the right direction.
Correct.
Yeah, and if I can add one thing, we actually will do a lot of load testing and actually throw the coals to the applications, and we will watch how things perform. And so, it's not just a blind. We saw this happening a month ago. When we actually put things up there, we'll actually see, like in the case of SQL, we'll look at the queue times and see how bad it's getting slammed. And so there's more than just an application based on a snapshot of data. We really look at it over time. The nice thing is that if we miss it, all we have to do is either slide up the slider for more cores or change the series of machines, and there's literally no impact.
That's excellent. Allows an organization to be more efficient with their budgeting, planning, and also be able to scale quick changes.
And this just goes deeper insight. If we did have to scale the workload based off initial recommendation, how much would we scale it up to? And also what's the cost and the sizing of that workload as we scale it up? So again, kind of giving you more information about if we do need to do this, keeping the customer informed, and also where the budget considerations that they do need to do it. You can go to the next slide, please.
Before we jump into this, Jeff, was there anything else that you wanted to add on the cost or performance considerations one?
Well, I think the big thing is that when you size for the active workload, you can set up auto scaling parameters on all of the workloads. And so you literally can take a steady state this month and say if you have year-end processing or people are coming for a certain time of year, you can actually do auto scaling where it will stand up additional instances and machines and pick up that load, which is pretty tough to do on-prem. You pretty much have to buy the horsepower and then hope that you don't get run over. But within the Azure world, we can do it at a machine VM level. We can do it at a ASE level or a application layer level. And so all of that stuff can be designed in, and we can even turn workloads off certain times of the day if they're, we use 8 to 5. So, there's just a lot more flexibility and capability, and a lot of it is automated. We actually can do scripting to do all of this. So if you forget to turn a machine off, it'll go in and turn itself off, that type of thing. So, that's really what we're trying to show is that, on-prem is still good. In fact, our background, we had 30,000 square feet of data centers for a long time, and we've moved 98% of that to the cloud just because of the flexibility. We had, I think I got 6 racks now in the data center. So, the use of the scalability in the tools is just huge.
So speaking of tools, the next one is, what are some discovery tooling and resources available to baseline migrations?
Yeah, this is a pretty cool one. The tools are ever evolving. We use probably about a half a dozen tools to do the initial discovery, and none of this stuff would work if we were not able to reach in and see what's running on-prem. So some of the tools we use Azure Migrate, which is a Microsoft tool that actually runs either through a client or OVR within the VM world, and it will actually monitor either the virtual machines or the physical machines over a period of time. It'll inventory everything that's in it. So tell us what kind of memory, storage, what's used storage, processors. It'll even tell us the vintage of the processor, as well as the current OS rev and the vintage nature of that. So we're able to take all of that data and we write it into SQL, and then we run other tools, a very similar tool that we've built that will interrogate SQL servers. And with that, we can then see what applications are talking to what. And so that also goes into SQL. And then we use several other tools that will identify the application dependencies and the network traffic, what's talking to what. And bottom line, what we try to do, and in fact, all of the forms you were just looking at are a result, a Power BI result of assembling all of that information. So what we try to do in this is to establish what is and what could be or should be, and then we can tune it on the fly through the Power BI by using that tool to just figure out what fits cost-wise and performance-wise within that environment. So I think we have some other slides in here, if you can go ahead. Yeah, this is a good example of the data that comes out of that. One of the biggest challenges we have with doing migrations is really migrating machines is sort of easy, to be quite frank. You can haul the trash and just virtualize everything on-prem and stand it up in Azure and it's there. That doesn't mean anything's going to work though. So what we actually try to do is we will go through the process of identifying all of the workloads and then see what is talking to what. And so what this diagram shows is all of the different variety of servers that are being used. So you'll see all of the stuff in red are application servers. The dark blue are SQL servers, and you can see that they sort of are the hub of the spoke because everything talks to SQL. And then we have a variety of other servers in there that will talk to them. So what you do with the process is you identify every server out there without really much information on the applications. And then once you do that, then you figure out where the applications live and what they talk to. So that's exactly how we use this diagram. And then we know that we will have to move, one of the SQL servers up there first. And then we move all of the individual databases up there through a SQL migration tool or other tools that we have. And then we will stand up the application side of that running inside of Azure, connect everything up, test it, and then it'll be available, to swing to once you want to go into production. Let's go to the next slide, I think.
The next one is the process. And before you go into that, a quick question. So obviously there's a lot of components in consideration. Is it transparent to the organization so there's no disruption? I imagine throughout the process, maintain uptime, get greater uptime.
It depends on how we do it. The approach that we always take is to minimize or completely eliminate downtime. If we are using Azure Site Recovery, we can actually do that very thing, because basically what you do, that particular process does haul the trash, but it will carry everything that's on-prem up to the cloud, all components, and so we will ASR all of the machines up there and then set up the networking and make everything work with an aliased URL or an aliased access that can be tested independently. And then the sync cycle on that is basically you can pause it, test everything in the cloud, and then if everything's good, you can either sync one last time and then break that sync, and then everything's in the cloud. So virtually no downtime, okay, with that approach. We actually prefer to build a brand new machine or VM in Azure. We call it a greenfield build, and then move applications up there. You can do a similar thing as long as you keep the data refreshed. And so we have methods of doing that, where you can actually build something new and move the application up there and do the testing on a test URL or test access, and then refresh the data once again, and then turn the on-prem off. swing the, a lot of times the IP addressing will change. And so we'll just make sure that the time to live or TTL on the DNS settings are set really low. And then, so there may be a 5-minute overlap where they're going to the old location versus the new. And, it's as short as that. It's pretty tough to get lower than that. But, the process is pretty seamless. We've done over 1,000 migrations now, into Azure. I don't even know how many. It's more than I can count. But anyways, the methodologies that we use really preclude a lot of outage time, which is good.
A well-oiled machine, clearly. So that leads into the next question is, what is getting to the process? And I think, I don't know if you want me to jump straight into talking through what does the process look like that's all together.
Yeah, and the way we approach this, we use a mind map document that sort of we walk through. I don't want to get real technical here, but basically we go into a discovery mode. And what that means is we actually discover the people and the organization as much as we do the applications and the servers. So we understand what the business processes are. And then we will actually, use the tools that we have to step in and do the the base inventory or the discovery of the workloads, wherever they are, storage, the VMs, all of that type of stuff. And then we will produce a report that you saw extracts of in the previous slides that actually are used to discuss what we think would be the good approach. And then that will normally give us a good look at what we think the costs are going to be, as Alan explained, and then we can sort of tweak those to see, when we do the inventory, we sort of inventory everything, and there's going to be a bunch of dead, machines in there. There's going to be things that we don't need to move. So we basically have a live document in Power BI where we can just, kill some of the machines. We can, say, don't move this one now. We can apply migration groups to all of that stuff. And so it's really a working session. And literally, the first discovery of people and such is an hour meeting. And then the working sessions are a couple hours after we have collected all of this stuff through the recommendations. Then we actually will step in once we think that there is a good move financially. Then that's when we actually start stepping in and looking at the app dependencies, which is a slide I just showed you. That actually will take a little bit more input. We can probably get close to what we think the app dependencies are, maybe 80 to 90% based on the information we have, but we can never get all the way there. So we'll need a lot of local intelligence, from your app dev teams to truly understand what that application is touching and how to move it. So that's really where we determine the server dependencies and the application dependencies. Then we actually will create out of that a complete statement of work, a delivery plan that will be, listing all of the deliverables at each milestone. And in that, we will actually identify, what we're moving when and who the responsible parties are. There'll be a sort of a application of responsibilities, both at the client level as well as our level. And then out of that SOW, which is generate deliverables, then we also have scheduling in there too. That's usually the hardest part, especially if you have customer outages that you have to worry about. Again, the nice thing is that we can usually push all of the infrastructure up there and leave it in a test mode within the Azure environment, and then do a last synchronization primarily of data, and then flip the switch. So it's pretty. I would say that it's laid out. Alan, if you want to add anything, Alan is the one that actually does a lot of the SOWs and the work step planning and such. So did I miss anything?
No, I didn't. We do a pretty good discovery session where we actually understand how we're going to land the resources in Azure, what subscription, resource group. We'll have access to those resources. That way we start to think about how best to do security and governance in the environment, as well as get the workloads running.
Yeah, and as far as the diagram on the right, we do a Azure Foundations rollout, and we actually push it into several subscriptions. And for people that aren't super familiar with the cloud, a subscription is basically a container. And what we try to do is separate the, and a lot of it is because of the zero trust aspects of things. We will actually deploy a production subscription, a pre-production or QA subscription, a services subscription, and a storage subscription. And the reason we do that outside of, a lot of people will just deploy to a single subscription up there. The challenge you have is that if you have, limited, say in production, you don't want everybody in the world to have access. It takes a lot. It's more. Let me reword that. You have everyone with access to that level. You may have people have access to production servers you don't want them to have access to. So we use it sort of along the line of security groups in AD, where you actually put the production servers up there and then give extremely limited access to being able to manage those servers and applications that live in that production subscription. We also only allow our services subscription to be the in and out connection for all of the activities via networking. You can put public IPs on any of the machines and any of the subscriptions, but the only ones that will ever get a public IP, you may have public IPs on a production subscription, especially if you're hosting apps there, but you'll have, web apps, you'll have WAFs and other firewalls there protecting it. The other ones, you have to get to those via internal networking, private VPN setup or otherwise. So you basically are providing a very secure area for all of that stuff. So I'm getting a little wordy here, and hopefully we're not running out of time, but that's what the diagram on the right is. It's a methodology to make sure that we keep everything as secure as possible, but still allow the flexibility to get access and manage things.
Perfect. Nope. And we are good on time. And you had my head spinning with more questions. And quickly before we answer this one, can you touch on, so does it have to be an all or nothing? Do you have to just go all cloud? Can you do hybrid? Sort of, what are your thoughts on that approach? And then on top of that, talking through when is the right time to make the move?
Yeah, definitely don't need to do that. We do a lot of hybrid work. There's always going to be a component of having to have on-prem hardware. A lot of times, file servers will stay local just because that's where they're accessed. We always try to do, we call it resilient identity. It's a fancy word for extending your AD into the cloud so you have redundancy. That's pretty important. So there are some cases where customers don't take a lot of machines up there, VMs, but they will take their O365 and their identity up there with Active Directory. The important thing to understand is that you can extend a traditional Active Directory node to Azure and it'll work just fine and you'll have full redundancy. You can also do what we'll touch on this more in the Zero Trust seminar that we're going to be doing. You can also use Azure Active Directory as your primary AD source, and you have full capabilities to do group policies and everything else, but it's extremely secure. So in the case of having on-prem AD, we've actually been first on site with several intrusions. A very large city in the southeast got owned a year and a half ago, and they got owned by having 28 domain admins at the email level. That's crazy. So, basically the same email that they were using and logging into, websites and email and everything else had AD admin credentials. And so basically one of those got owned, and within a very short period of time, they had deleted every backup, tokenized all of the active stuff, and, basically, ransomwared them all. So what we try to do, and that was all because you had an AD admin level person, that was using their email. So if you do Azure AD, there is no such thing as a admin level person. You actually can apply policies and such, but you can never get to the top and take over everything. So it's a hybrid there. Hybrid, Alan, you got any other hybrid examples? But, it may be virtual desktops.
Virtual desktops are good for remote work, and also Defender for Cloud can, do a security posture assessment of both your Azure resources and your on-prem resources and any other cloud resource you have. So it's an extremely powerful tool. to always understand your security vulnerabilities, your risk, and how to remediate those on an ongoing basis as workloads change, as requirements change. It's always being more proactive and giving suggestions and alerting you to discrepancies or remediations to make as well. So extremely powerful tools in Azure for that.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you can apply those on-prem, like SQL, Defender for SQL and such, and then you can feed those into a dashboard, common dashboard, Sentinel or whatever. And so, you can, it really depends, like, especially if you have a manufacturing facility, you have to have stuff on-prem just to control everything. And so what you do is you just separate out the stuff, like you may have a ETL workload, a transactional database on-prem, and you pushed all of the analytics up to Azure. So you can do all of your, SSAS or Synapse and a lot of the other analytics that are available. You can hollow all of the, the analytics side of things up there and then process all of that, offload anything on-prem that would affect your production. So, I mean, it's as varied as you want to get and have things available with that. So hopefully I answered that okay.
Yeah, you did. And it speaks to the point that there's plenty of flexibility, but then that also means there's plenty of time to sort of start that transition and the migration of whether it's moving one application, multiple end of life. So we've outlined 4 areas that we find are ideal times for companies to make that move. If you want to talk through these, and I'm sure there are others that may not be relevant, but as people are starting to think through, okay, building the plan, understanding when is the right time to make that transition, key decision points that they should think about, what are those?
Yeah, these are big ones, and they're pretty much self-explanatory. The big one is actually whether you want to sink a lot of capital into the new hardware. The nice thing about Azure, if licensing, let's talk a little bit about that. A lot of times with hardware on-prem and software on-prem, you buy an enterprise agreement from Microsoft, which allows licensing to be applied to servers and desktops and such, that type of thing. If you buy software assurance, you can actually use that very same license that's being unused on-prem in Azure. So you can actually buy a VM up there with no OS, which is, usually around, 25-30% cheaper to do that. So you can really use what you've already leveraged, licensing wise on that. The other thing is that the revision level will normally not cost you anything to up to the next revision if you're running in Azure. You're paying the same amount if you're including the license with the machine in Azure. The new revisions that come out, you can implement at no cost. You just do an upgrade. So you're not having to, buy the licensing, especially on OEM licensing, that you're sort of screwed. When the revision ends, you're out of luck. You got to buy a new one. So that's a big part of it. New applications, you're always current when you're running in Azure on technology. And the big thing that we see, not only do we right size equipment, but you're running on newer processors. So, one of the old things is everybody used to buy SQL Enterprise, just because they wanted the horsepower and the ability. That's expensive. Now you can do almost as much with standard, with memory as well as processing power at a fifth of the cost. And so, we're looking at ways, because we have stronger processors, faster IO buses, memory buses up in Azure. And it's unreal. Like in the old days, if I can just say this one thing, in the old days, we never put SQL on a virtual machine, whether it was VMware or the cloud. We always had hardware, and we always had, fiber attached storage or something like that. We actually smoked our on-prem fiber attached storage infrastructure with Azure. At the time, it was a G5 machine, which happens to be a pretty expensive dedicated hypervisor, but it was tripled the IO for SQL running in the cloud. Who knew? So basically, what we've shown is that because they're running brand new processors, brand new memory, brand new backplane infrastructure, they separate their storage from their VMware platform so they can independently upgrade that at any time. The SSDs that they have are widely used now. How many classes of SSDs are there now, Alice?
There's 4.
4. So, it's just a lot of flexibility in being able to build performance.
Excellent. Alan, any other times you're seeing clients, or are these some of the big 4?
Those are usually the big 4, the big motivating factors usually.
Perfect. Okay. So before we get into final thoughts, a case study. I don't know, Alan or Greg, who wants to kick this one off and tell us about this example?
I can tag team it with them if you want. This was a large provider of VoIP solution. Basically, they have a product that they can do surveys over a soft phone on an application, and they support the political industry, and their SQL loads are monstrous. So basically, we had to come up with a method, and they were a customer in our data center, by the way. And so we had the infrastructure on-prem, and actually these were the guys that caused us to rethink our SQL, just because of the performance. But basically what we did is we migrated all of this to the cloud and then built out an application framework that could auto scale, and then also auto scaled all of the back-end application servers. Because basically within the political world, your elections are every 2 years. So you have to be able to scale up to monstrous amounts of compute power, and then within a month you scale it back down. So the infrastructure that we built actually has the same core, design. We just scale it up. And so the process of doing this is automatic, which is crazy. So as the load goes up, we actually have, there's several ways to do it, but the web front ends will get to a certain utilization amount, and it'll spawn another node and include itself in the load balancer, and it picks up additional load. The same thing with the VoIP engine on the back end. And on the SQL, we actually have the ability to partition some of the data, and so we can actually spawn SQL at the same level too. So just a lot of flexibility with what you can do. That if you are on-prem, I basically bought SQL servers that sat there for a year and a half and didn't do anything. So anyways, hopefully that covers that.
Yeah, that's an incredible example of the flexibility. Okay, final thoughts. We covered security, disaster recovery, and data protection, performance, the tooling, the process, and how you do it, and the visibility, the considerations. Alan, what are your final thoughts? And then we'll let Jeff give some final. What are the takeaways that our attendees should have?
Takeaways is don't be afraid of the cloud. It is intimidating at first, but there are avenues and there are partners to help you understand exactly how best to utilize Azure in the cloud. And we're here long-term for your success. As you mature in your understanding of the cloud, as your applications mature, we can mature with you and make sure that you're getting the best benefit of the cloud. Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, exactly that. You definitely don't be afraid of it. With a guide, you can do crazy things. What I'll also say, though, is that a lot of times you may not feel comfortable with having something run in the cloud. So why not put up a proof of concept? We do that all the time. We had a customer that had a really big file servers that they wanted to do a SMB or a NAS connection to, and so we just put up a POC for them and made sure that they could map to it, for Azure files, and so they could do the Office side of things. With the CSP, which is the cloud service provider capabilities that we actually have the ability to sell all of the services in the cloud directly to the customer, or you can buy them from Microsoft through an EA. We don't care. Either way, you have a tenant in the cloud that we can then move things to. So if you're concerned about putting all your eggs up there, start out small, and the cost of doing the initial discoveries, to be quite frank, a lot of times we'll get Microsoft to pay for that. And they will help us migrate through some of the ESIF funding and other things, a lot of workloads up there. And we actually apply for that funding directly, so We can help individual customers. Typically we can't do that for small customers, but if we have 50, 60 workloads that we're moving, then we can do it. But the actual discovery part of this is either no cost or low cost. And so nothing else, we can baseline your infrastructure and give you a report that says what's going on inside your own house, which, to be quite frank, a lot of times the CIOs don't even have. So
I get multiple reasons why people should reach out after the webinar. And one item that I liked that you touched on is the cloud's not secure by design. It has all those capabilities, but you have to know what to turn on, how to provision it, how to set it up so that it is secure. And I think that's something that obviously our expertise plays into that, but then organizations need to be aware of and not just assume that it's in the cloud, it's protected, it's secure. There are capabilities, but they have to be designed into it. And we are going to go to wrap here and see if there are any questions. One was, and I think you touched on it earlier, were any considerations around the shared responsibility model with Microsoft? And maybe that's what you had touched on with the data protection component, but Jeff, anything that you can add on to that?
I think the shared responsibility is one of those murky things too, where people assume that everything is going to be protected when they put stuff up there. You have to share the responsibility to protect things. Now we can turn on a whole lot of different modules through Defender that will help with that. And by the way, Defender is built in at the identity level, so email and such like that, depending on which seat you get. You also can buy it separately at a pretty inexpensive price, whether it's on a server or otherwise. So you can choose how you want to do that. But the shared responsibility is making sure that your identities are protected and that you do phishing, training and stuff like that. The good thing is that if you truly use a zero trust topology, the only thing that people will be phished for is their own email and their own stuff. So that's a good thing.
Perfect. Well, thank you for answering that one. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. So I want to thank you both for taking the time to share your expertise, and thank you to everyone who attended. And as Jeff mentioned, our next webinar is going to be looking at zero trust. So we will be sure to get an invite out to everyone. So thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Alan. And thanks to all of our attendees.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good one.